Today you might find this gospel passage funny, strange, because does anybody here know what a mite is? I have no idea. I had to look it up. What is a mite? In the King James Bible, there's a certain a poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which makes a farthing. Does anybody know what a farthing is? I have no idea at all. The passage still today is often called the widow's mite, even though many of us would know a mite if we saw one, unless probably we had some mites in our cat's ears. But other than that, we would never know what a mite is, would we? Well, I had to check and found that a mite is something small, often a coin, according to the King James Bible. And together, if you had 2 of them, they made a farthing. A farthing was an old British coin taken out of circulation about 40 or 50 years ago. The widow's mite translation doesn't even make sense in Britain anymore because they got rid of the farthing and the mite. Ours reads a little bit differently. A poor widow came and put in 2 small pennies, or a few coins, which are worth a penny. But no matter what translation we use, the point is the widow was poor. She was dirt poor, and she gave all she had, those 2 tiny coins. Fantastic. A story that clearly talks about sacrificial giving in the church. The widow only had 2 coins, and she gave them both, everything that she had. What a fantastic message for the holiday season for all of us. To give, and to give. If we were in the midst of a campaign to raise money for the Women's Center or Family Services, I'd be sorely tempted to preach a similar sermon, to give until it hurts. But we're not, and I'm not going to do so. Such a simple sermon does not do justice to this gospel. I think we're missing a lot if we just think that. And as usually happens, God is up to something here a bit more tricky, more compelling, and more extreme than we might first imagine. The story of the widow's mite calls all authority into question. That's what Jesus is doing. He's calling the scribes and the Pharisees into question, and he's been doing it for weeks now in the Gospels. For several chapters before today's reading, Jesus repeatedly connects the temple, or today's church, with corruption. Fits pretty aptly, I think. He goes to the temple and throws out all those selling and buying goods inside of God's house, if you remember. Next, Jesus tells a few parables against the scribes and the Pharisees that upholds the temple etiquette, the ones that dress in long robes and long tassels, the ones who take the best seats in the synagogue. Then, sitting in the temple himself, Jesus begins the passage we read today. So, we have to put ourselves in Jesus' place. Jesus is sitting in the temple, and off to the side of the temple was a treasury room that people would bring their money to. And a guy would take your money and write it in a book that you gave so much, and then you would take your seat in the temple. So Jesus positioned himself very close to that door, and he was watching people go in and out as he usually does. He always watches. And he says, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the best seats in synagogues and places of honor at banquets." The story about the widow's mite continues, and Jesus then leaves the temple and says that it's going to be destroyed. Coming up, he's going to say that it's going to be destroyed. The great temple of Jerusalem, where they're all gathering here, destroyed it was a few years later. That's the problem with the traditional reading of our story, but I'm going to give it a twist today. If you notice, read it again, Jesus doesn't praise the widow for giving the money. Though it'd make us feel better if he did, probably. No, he says that the temple she gave it to will be destroyed. and that's coming up. A few years ago, I was in line at Hickson's, about a year ago. Does anybody know where Hickson's is? It's a seafood place in Fall River. And the guy in line was talking about the church and how they're being closed right and left in the city of Fall River, and now since then even more. The churches right now are being closed at 3 to 4 to 6 every single year in the Diocese of Fall River for the Roman Catholic Church. And he turned and said, I heard that St. Anne's is going to be closing. Now this is a couple of years back, a year or two ago. He said, I heard that St. Anne's is going to be closing. And the guy turned and said to him, oh, I thought it was already closed down. And there you go. There you go. This guy thought that St. Anne's was already closed. You can see how many people are really going to church and how the church is falling, very similar to how Jesus said the temple would fall. And I was kind of astonished remembering that. In the surrounding verses, though, of our text this morning, Jesus doesn't just call the temple into question, today's church. He attacks the leaders of the temple as well. Beware of the scribes, he says. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. So the more money you give them, the more they pray. My friend Stephen, who I worked with in Oak Hill in Pawtucket, used to say in Italian, and it's a lot funnier when they say it in Italian. He says, without the money, the priest can't sing the Mass. Without money, the priest, but in Italian it's really, really funny. And this is what we're getting today in the gospel. The scribes are taking money from everyone. Jesus is not very happy with these scribes grabbing money in their fancy robes from the poor. And he says in today's gospel, they're going to receive their greater condemnation. So Jesus undercuts the temple today, saying it's going to be, well, coming up, it'll be destroyed, the center of Jewish religion at the time. And Jesus said that the scribes were a ripoff to the poor. It'd be nice to think that Jesus cracked on the scribes, and I'm glad he did, and also on the temple that he cracked, and he raised up a great example in this widow. But when Jesus tells the story of the widow giving her only 2 pennies, he never praises her. He never really praises her. He never actually makes a value judgment over her great sacrifice. He just says, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those contributed to the treasury. Sure, she gave out of her poverty. That's admirable. They out of their wealth. But Jesus never said, be like her. He never says, be like her. He just says, don't be like those scribes. Have you ever been broken down, I mean truly broken down, until there's nothing left for you to give? I'll be honest, I haven't. So I'm not quite sure about this. But I've been thinking this week, with Veterans Day approaching, about the military. I've heard the challenges of boot camp described as breaking one down. We've all heard that. When they take a kid in, they break him down, chisel away until they're beginning to build that person back up, man or woman. I think that's what the Word does today. It breaks us down. Don't put your trust in the temple. Don't put your trust in the priests who run the temple. Don't put your trust in showy religious figures. Don't put your trust even in politicians. But then this old widow gives her all to that corrupt institution. And Jesus doesn't praise that at all. He just says it like it is. Her money, all her money is given to corruption. Corruption that we will see very shortly will bring the temple down. She has nothing to live on, and what she did have will only feed those fat cats in charge. The widow isn't an example of good giving. It sounds like it, but the widow isn't an example of good giving. She's an age-old example of being duped. She's the modern-day equivalent of a senior citizen who's been tricked on the phone to give her bank account information to a criminal. And the church is criminal today. She's the widow who gave all she had to charity, as so many have done throughout the years, have given their money to the church day in and day out. And it was criminal what they did with this money. Just a front for swindlers who send their money back to another country, Rome. So what's left? Jesus broke us down. What's to build us back up here? What's the good news in this kind of disturbing text as I spin it? Jesus noticed her. Of all the people there, he noticed this woman. Jesus was hanging in the temple and hundreds were bringing their money forward, as I said. The rich, the powerful, the prestigious, the ones with new cars and new shoes and fancy phones. They came forward to place their offering at the plate. And Jesus noticed her with her 2 pennies, the widow. The woman without an income. She's a widow. She could not work in that society. And she was worth nothing to that society at all. Widows were not worth much at all. But Jesus noticed her specifically. Jesus is always doing that. Through the Gospels, you will see it time and time again. He notices things that we don't notice. Jesus is present. We've been talking about being present on Thursday nights in meditation. To be present. And Jesus definitely was present in this situation and in others. He was present enough to see this widow that others did not see. He's always doing this through the gospel. He's always talking to prostitutes. He's always being kind to foreigners. And he always welcomes children. Jesus doesn't give a lick about power and prestige, but he's about caring for the vulnerable, for the aged in our society, for those that are vulnerable. That's what he's ultimately saying here today. He says to go after the vulnerable, to be attentive to the vulnerable, and to condemn the rest of the scribes and Pharisees at the same time. So this age-old passage on the widow's mite doesn't lend itself just to simple giving sermon. It's nice if I preach on just, wasn't it nice she gave out of her need? Isn't that nice? And it's good that she did that. I'm not saying that. But this age-old passage is about more. It is about being attentive and being present to those around us that are in pain, that are in need, those that society pushes away. No, Jesus is up to much more in these Gospels if we pay attention. So take note.